Okay, everybody, how's it going? I hope you are doing well wherever you might be. My name is David Parsons. This is The Nostalgia Trap. This week we're talking about housing. I've been wanting to do a show about housing for a while. You know, I've been teaching this class called Suburban Nation over the years at a number of different institutions. And the class is sort of like a wide-ranging history of housing policy in the United States. And it always, every time I teach it, and I just finished teaching it this summer, every time I teach it, it just reminds me that housing is really at the center of some of the most, massive ideological debates in American life. And that the idea of, the way we live sort of touches on, really big structural things like redlining and racism and capitalism and the idea of, wealth transference. But also, some of the most intimate stuff we talk about, which, like family and gender and sexuality, and all of this stuff is often packaged in pop culture in really, really powerful and surprising ways. So I wanted to have a conversation about housing, and I wanted to have it with Yasmin Nair, because Yasmin is someone who's not only a favorite Nostalgia Trap guest, she's someone who I feel like I can throw any idea at, and she's going to have something compelling to say in response. And she always surprises me with her kind of analytical takes on things. And she has a lot to say about the history of housing in America and her particular perspective on it, living in Chicago. So, and being from Calcutta. So she talks about that history, and we get into, pop culture. We talk about Mad Men. We talk about a whole bunch of stuff in this conversation. And even, if you'll forgive us, we got into how much both of us hate Hamilton at the beginning here. So we have a little bit of Hamilton hatred for those of you who are either into that or not into that. We've got that for you here. So I hope you enjoy this conversation and all our Nostalgia Trap conversations. And thank you, Yasmin, for being game for such a wide-ranging discussion on housing. I had a lot of fun with this one. So if you want to support our show, please do so. That's at patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. We're an independent operation. We don't do ads. Wouldn't make sense to do ads. We have no corporate backers or anything like that. And increasingly, I'm doing the, Nostalgia Trap work is sort of like some of the central work I do as a historian academic. So the contributions that people make to this show mean a whole lot to me. So if you can contribute, you will get access to bonus material and all our cool stuff at patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. And thank you so much to everyone that's already supporting the show. Okay, I hope you enjoyed this conversation. Here is me and Yasmin on housing in America. All right, Yasmin, it's always wonderful to have you. I was entranced by your social media this weekend because I knew you were watching Hamilton along with everybody else. Okay, so let me just preface by saying I have not seen Hamilton other than like a couple clips of it, which were excruciating. But it's weird because I assume how I know a little bit of how you feel about it, and I know you're going to write a piece about it. But I don't understand. To me, have you ever seen a cultural object that's so beloved? Like, honestly, like people are really, really insistent upon this piece. Like it's as if it's the greatest work of art that's ever been produced. I mean, apart from like just how we see it, I know you and I are probably the type of people to look at it and be like, what the fuck is this? Hip hop founding fathers shit. But like, it seems important because so many people are so fucking invested in it, right?
Yes. There was a funny tweet. Twitter is useful for humor. I think Twitter is always so funny. It's not always. I don't think it's a place for social justice, but it's a place for really fucking funny commentary. and someone said, hey, what are the chances that 50 years from now we're going to find out that a certain someone was actually deployed by the CIA to produce Hamilton, to squelch dissent of any sort. I mean, one of the more interesting pieces, I forget whose, but I'll link to all of them in my piece, it was Ishmael Reed, actually. Ishmael Reed wrote a longish piece for Counterpunch about, his counter play that he wrote in response to Hamilton, which I believe is the same one that was funded, actually, by Toni Morrison. Apparently, Toni Morrison saw Hamilton, was so fucking angry about it.
That's amazing.
She said, I will fund, she's like, I will fund an anti-Hamilton production. And, and I haven't read Reed's piece. And, in all honesty, I feel like sometimes, anything that's overtly political sometimes tends to be didactic and not particularly great. So I don't know. It might be a great Ishmael Reed's piece, play might be fantastic. But I was more interested in his account of how Hamilton became a cultural object. That was fascinating, because what he does provide is just the bare bones elements of how critical responses formed in response to Hamilton in a way that was, he makes it clear that this was all about powers from up above, basically saying, there is no fucking way we're not going to like this play. He talks about, for instance, right? So for instance, he talks about even at The Nation, he tried to get The Nation to respond to his piece. And I think they sent like some intern or something like that, someone who really wasn't at all trained in theater, had no expertise in the issues. And then of course, the ways in which when they did get, I think, the New York Times critic to come and cover Reed's performance, etc., she was sort of disdainful, and it was clear she hadn't really paid much attention, etc., etc. I mean, if you read Ishmael Reed's piece in Counterpunch, I may have glossed over some of the details. I might not have gotten them completely correct, but it is fascinating I think what's fascinating about Hamilton is exactly what you point to at the very beginning, which is the ways in which there's a way in which a cultural production comes into view in the public eye, and for certain political and cultural reasons, it is decided that this will be the thing, Right. And there's a whole emperor has no clothes situation going on with Hamilton. It is fucking bad. Let me just say, I am not an expert on hip hop or any kind of, mine is like, as you know, right, is white boy rock. I mean, I'm the first one to say this, right? I mean, I'm a devotee of, John Cale. That's my school, so I'm not an expert on anything that's considered alternative or hip or anything.
Yeah, I'm thinking about Lou Reed watching Hamilton. I'm not sure what his take on it is going to be, but yeah, there's that part of it too, which just seems like really chronically unhip from that point of view.
It is so bad, even I know that.
Yeah. But people love it, and it seems like
and it's racist.
So that's the thing that bothered me, and here's what, like, my experience with it was through students who were like really love it, right? Like, all these students, like college students, not everyone. I mean, some of them saw through it, and like there would be like it'd be a lot of woke students who were really into it, but then there would be like a radical student who would bring up like, well, did you know that Lin-Manuel Miranda is like, involved with this Promesa, like bank shit in Puerto Rico, and the people of Puerto Rico fucking hate him, and the play is racist, and they would bring up these things, and the other students would be like, they would acknowledge those problems, but then just be like, oh, but it's so good, like the Hamilton is so good though, and like that to me is like, that's power, like that's the power of a cultural object. Yeah.
It is not good. I mean, I like musicals, and I've been beginning to like them a lot more. I've been watching a lot more. I have a real respect for good musicals, but it's a shitty musical. Every fucking song sounds the same. There are only like one or two songs that have, even variations on either a theme or dare we say the beat, whatever the fuck passes for a beat in this damn thing. But every song, after a while, I can't, for one thing, I haven't been able to watch more than half of it yet. And that's because I can't watch more than 15-minute increments, if that. And then like even during the 15 minutes that I find myself quote unquote watching it, I have to keep leaving the room. So, and when I leave the room, I just keep hearing this stupid shit blathering on in the background. I'm like, this is the same as the first song or the second song. There's no difference. So it's awful on every level, and it is racist as shit because it is willfully, Current Affairs' Alex Nichols wrote an excellent piece, I think the best piece so far about it.
I agree. That's a great piece. Yep.
It's an amazing piece. So he said, he has said a lot of what I would say. I have some things to add to that, but I think it's racist because it erases racism by pretending that somehow putting people of color in the lead roles, somehow everyone's like, well, it's so great that we get to see people of color in the historical narrative. I'm like, as friends of mine and I pointed, When were they not part of the historical narrative? And that's part of the problem, right? Hamilton is all about a time and an era and a foundational period. This country is founded on genocide and slavery. So making Native Americans or African Americans part of that narrative doesn't even destabilize that narrative. It simply reimposes it. It's dreadful. And there are these horrible woke moments like that famous line where he says, immigrants, we get the job done. And there's, of course, this tumultuous applause from the audience. And it's ghastly. It's basically a kind of a woke rendition of history. It's a way of saying American history wasn't all that bad. And of course, it's no surprise. Yes, you have woke young people perhaps, but also rich old white donors who could afford this ticket prices.
Dick Cheney and Mike Pence love it. George W. Bush, they all love it. One of the greatest lines that I saw on it, I think you would love it. It was probably one of those funny Twitter moments was someone said that, because Michelle Obama famously watched Hamilton and said that it was because they did part of it at the White House. This was like all of it was like woven in with the Obama narrative. And Michelle Obama famously said that it was the greatest work of art that she'd ever witnessed. And the tweet that went viral said, if that's true, that doesn't speak well to like Yale, as an institution of higher education. Because it's kind of like, it's insane to me that to me, maybe it reveals how empty the neoliberal like project is for them to be talking about this as if it is something like akin to Hamlet or something like. It's just the over the top is response actually to me like signals exactly what you're saying. Like, well, when we ought to be paying attention to this if this is this powerful a cultural object.
Right. And Obama, I think, even noted the fact that he said something like, it says something that both Dick Cheney and I both like this. And I thought, yes, it does. Yes, it does. You're all fucking neoliberals. That's what it says.
Yeah, and to me, like it's exactly what neoliberalism is about. Like, I know people like often overuse that term, and it's kind of a slippery definition. But Hamilton to me is a perfect representation of what that is, at least on a cultural end, because it's basically using like eroticized people of color and this kind of like hip hop vibe to try and cover over like literally the most monstrous crimes of capitalism that the story is literally telling you, and to even like acknowledge like slavery or Thomas Jefferson being a rapist or anything like that as like a sideshow. No, like real historians know that those things are woven into the ideology. You can't treat them as some sort of like include them or not. If you don't include them, you don't tell the story. So like that part of it to me is why Hamilton is so infuriating, and also just watching it like literally be a product that allows people to defend erasure and say, you know what, like I don't want to hear about slavery. This is a fun play, and you can just enjoy it. And why don't you just enjoy it? And like that part of it really bothers me, the kind of like insistence. Like it's almost like, I hate to use this woke term, but I'm being fucking gaslit by Hamilton fans, Yasmin. They're telling me they're telling me like I'm crazy and being like a spoil sport for the fun if I don't really enjoy it. And like that part of it to me is really gross kind of language.
It is. And I think it's so interesting, whatever we call the left and the ways in which lefty progressives are all about, yay, BLM, yay, toppling statues. And then when you start to question them about something as simple as, their tastes, perhaps, right?
Yeah.
Then it becomes, how dare you? How dare you question my anti-racist credentials? And look, I have friends who've said, look, maybe it's a problematic show, but I enjoy a good musical. I'm okay with that, right? I watch Agatha Christie. I read Agatha Christie. I read terribly problematic fiction all the time. And I watch, rom-coms. It's fine. But I think to not acknowledge that, I think there's a particular strand of the left which wants to think about cultural production as somehow completely, and the consumption of cultural production as somehow completely insular, divorced from anything like politics or any kind of political, any political ramifications at all. So when you critique something or criticize something that they're watching or enjoying, and you say, this is kind of troubling, rather than saying, yeah, it's troubling, but I like it, which is kind of a response I'm okay with.
Yeah,
right?
me too, totally.
That's fine. Yeah, pleasure. Take pleasure in whatever. But then to say, well, no, it's not, and how dare you? And then suddenly they become completely anti-Marxist. Suddenly all of their ideological apparatuses just sort of fade away, apparently. When it comes to that, we're just supposed to treat it as if it were like taste an ice cream. No, this is not about whether you like vanilla or praline pecan or whatever the hell, whatever new flavor is. I know those are very old-fashioned flavors by now. But yeah, it's not your taste in ice cream. We are talking about a political event. It's also not just a cultural event. Hamilton is a political event in that sense at this point.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, if it's being like, part of the White House, and it's used as a sort of like, I don't know, almost like it does make me believe that that Miranda might be CIA in the way that the cultural object is kind of connected to a certain kind of politics. And like, I wanted to get back to that ice cream thing. I mean, maybe we can move on from Hamilton, but I think it's just a really great take on it that is from my friend Justin. That was kind of very close to what you're saying right there, which he said, if Hamilton is a guilty pleasure, it's and that's fine. Guilty. I love guilty pleasures. That's all. I mean, maybe we should not even think of them as guilty. I like all sorts of stupid shit. But Hamilton is rarely narrated as a guilty pleasure, right? No one says it. No one, and that's. I think that's what you just said. Is like no one acknowledges it as such. Instead, they're like saying that no, this is actually like a really like vibrant and important work of art. And instead of saying like this is just kind of a fun play and it's got it's riffing on the founding fathers, I might be all right with it. But instead, this is being presented as sort of, I don't know, something that can almost repair our nation and bring together the Dick Cheneys and the Obamas of the world. Right.
Right. Yeah. No, it's awful. It's just awful. Yeah.
All right. So Hamilton seems like in a lot of ways like it's kind of like a tool of gentrification, or like, and that's our segue. Right. Yeah, but we want to. I mean, you and I have been talking about housing for a while, because housing, as a conversation, it's really it's kind of funny because I just got finished teaching this course on the American suburbs, which I've taught a few times, and it's a really fun class, and like it gets the students thinking about all sorts of like different issues with housing. But we always come to this like conclusion that like housing is like one of the most fundamental ways that people experience their lives, and yet it's not really part of the political discourse as much as it should be. And I was wondering because what the view from Chicago is like in terms of gentrification and housing just in 2020, because right before the pandemic happened, and I think the pandemic is forcing everyone to think about how they live, obviously, because we're all stuck at home. But like right before the pandemic, we did a show with a journalist named Rick Paulus, and he told us about this movement, Moms for Housing, of like women in Oakland, like black women of, working class black women in Oakland who had taken over. They were occupying houses and like, and it was like, housing was a big part of like almost a Black Lives Matter type anti-gentrification urban movement that was happening. And then the pandemic came and like, there was this retreat, in some ways, or at least the conversation for housing starts to go away. But I mean, what's it like in Chicago? What's the view with housing there? Because it seems like, I assume that it's close to the other cities of the United States, like Oakland or Los Angeles or San Francisco or New York, where gentrification has really been the story for the last like 2 decades. Absolutely.
I was just talking to a friend of mine, I think on Saturday, who's now living in Washington, but he was a grad student here some years ago, and he just graduated this last year. And he said when he came back for his graduation, he couldn't recognize, the city as he stepped off the L. He's at Lincoln Square. Lincoln Square has always been a high point of gentrification. It's sort of on the north side. It's closer to downtown. It's a very posh area. It wasn't originally that way at all 30 years ago. Lincoln Square is where the famous artist Henry Darger used to live. I don't know if you know him. He's that outsider artist.
I'm looking at the book right now in the realm of the unreal. Yeah, his stuff is insane. Yeah. Yep.
Right, it's amazing. And the house So he lived in the garden of a house in Lincoln Square they gave him, I think he exchanged labor, I think, of all sorts for living in this tiny little sort of shed-like house. It's when he died that they went in and they found all of this artwork of his. And that family actually is now, and I don't think there was anything necessarily unscrupulous about this, but the family is now, basically living off the proceeds of all his artwork.
Oh, God bless him, Jesus.
Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly.
Because just to pause, for those that don't know the Henry Darger story, I mean, this was a guy that was like, no one knew him in his life. He was a nobody who like basically, was shacked up in this little place in Chicago, right? And literally
Lincoln Square.
Created this insane amount of artwork in his room, and it was discovered after he died, and I think there's even there's big museum exhibitions, and they made a documentary about him, and his artwork is really intense.
Really intense.
Yeah,
and people have to go look at it to see why it's so intense.
Yes.
It's about little girls and little boys. Actually, there aren't any little boys, I think. But anyway, it's a wonderful corpus of work. It's really astonishing, really interesting. But that house, all of that was while he was making his artwork. All of that was while Lincoln Square was kind of beaten up and broken down, and kind of on the, it's on the cusp of gentrification, etc. So Lincoln Square, all of these, So Chicago definitely is driven with gentrification efforts. What's going to be interesting is to see how the pandemic affects or does not affect it. And I live in Hyde Park, which is on the south side of Chicago, and it's dominated by the University of Chicago. Now, University of Chicago owns pretty much all the land around here. Mm-hmm. And what it has done is to collude with a major developer called Mac Corporation. I'm calling it Mac Corporation, kind of like the Aeon Corporation in the movies. But Mac is one of the biggest renters in the area. They've pretty much gobbled up all the bigger rental, sort of apartment complexes. And then they built this gigantic, I think it's like 23, 24 floor high rise right opposite me. So I endured construction noise for over a year. And they built it for students. They built them as rental units. So what's been happening in Hyde Park, at least, is interesting because the shift has been from condominiums to rental units. They were banking on the fact that University of Chicago students pay the highest tuitions in, I think now the world, $100,000 a year. And these are very expensive condominiums. We're talking about studios for $2,500, etc. And now it'll be interesting to see what happens to that rental market as the pandemic hits across the country. And you have, especially with university towns, as students decide whether or not to return, as universities decide or try to decide. Everything is still very much up in the air as far as the University of Chicago is concerned. But in Hyde Park alone, there have been quite a lot of protests against Mac, various other landlords here for exploitative, conditions, for not taking care of tenants' rights. There have been the issues around when the pandemic hit. Tenants were first told that they would not, I think there was an eviction stay even in the city, but some landlords have not followed that, etc. But the point, I guess the simple point here is that Chicago, like many other cities, has seen wave after wave of gentrification. It has pushed people out because we're in flatlands as opposed to, say, New York, where everything is horizontal, right?
Right.
But, we can spread outwards into other parts of the Midwest, right? So what's happening, for instance, is that Section 8 housing for Chicagoans can also count in, say, Gary, Indiana, on the sort of the edge between Indiana and Illinois, etc. So people are just being pushed out in that way. And of course, and there are rates of homelessness, etc. All of that is complicated by the pandemic.
Yeah,
I find this whole,
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking about, because I mean, it seems like there's like kind of almost like a white flight going on during the pandemic. Like, I mean, certainly what I'm hearing from New York is that, like, Park Slope, in Brooklyn kind of emptied out, and the areas of Upper West Side and Upper East Side emptied out as people escaped to their Hampton homes and stuff like that. So it's interesting to hear you say, like, this notion of being pushed out of the city, because like there's times in history where rich white people want to be in the city,
yes,
and times in history when rich white people don't want to be in the city. And it seems like we're like the people that are the rest of us are kind of at the whim of that historical kind of those historical waves, and that part of it seems like really confusing in the pandemic. I'm not sure what's happening. Do you think that's happening in Chicago too? Is there like a drain of like people with money left the city?
I think what I'm hearing is that people with money now are this might be better for those of us who are looking for rentals. What's happening apparently, what I'm hearing on the street is that people are now deciding that, well, if I'm going to have to keep working from home, I may as well just buy something cheaper in the burbs. So apparently that's something that's going on, is people are deciding to buy stuff but in the suburbs. And what's interesting is that I was just reading a Tribune article the other day that said that actually, and I don't know if this is necessarily true, and it is coming from the Tribune, which, like the New York Times, is deeply invested in neoliberal shittery.
Sure.
But according to the Tribune, housing prices are not actually going down. I mean, so in other words, I think for a while we all thought, oh, maybe this is the time for people to buy, right, houses on the cheap. But apparently that's not the case. I don't know if that's true. What it did prompt me to do, though, is to think about the history of housing in the United States and this whole idea of rentals versus home ownership.
Oh,
right?
Please, please.
Yeah, this long, fucking complicated history. And I actually thought it was much more recent that we had moved in the U.S. from thinking about, renting perhaps to home ownership. But it turns out that it's actually been about 100 years or so now. And it's actually pretty foundational to the founding of this country. Speaking of Hamilton, this idea that home ownership, right, should actually be what people aspire to has been around for a long time. But and I think more recently there's been all this discussion about, well, should people, all of this discussion about wealth. I find that discussion really interesting. And when I say interesting, I mean troubling. There's a lot of talk, for instance, about, well, we should, the concept of black wealth, right? So people will often talk about the fact that, of course, as we know, when the recessions hit, like the last one, like the foreclosure crisis, of course, it impacted instantly Black homeowners the most, who had already been swept up under very nefarious home ownership schemes, etc., all of that. And that now with the pandemic, as it is, African-American communities are the ones that are most badly hit by the pandemic, which makes them more economically vulnerable, which means that wealth accretion, right, in the African-American community is sliding, etc., etc. I just think that's so lopsided, right? Because we're talking about wealth and home ownership, and we should be talking about security in housing and the right to housing. And if we were to start talking about that, perhaps we would start talking about the concept of wealth differently. Perhaps we would actually stop talking about the concept of wealth. I mean, to me, it really baffles me when I hear people on the left talking about home ownership and how communities can accrue wealth. I get it, right? I totally get it.
Yeah.
But I don't understand why the left of all places is going.
No, that's true. That's a good point. I mean, so one of the points that comes up a lot in this class that I teach on the suburbs is and it comes up in a lot of like liberal books. Like I think the idea the word comes up the most in the book that is kind of one of our textbooks, which is this book by a Harvard professor named Dolores Hayden called Building Suburbia. And she talks about the racial wealth gap, right? Which is exactly what you're talking about. And it's a totally like liberal concept, but she's saying that like, because the FHA, when it began under the New Deal, like didn't include Black people and basically saw the suburbs as in totally like a white project, ended up like, creating a system in which wealth is transferred like most profoundly by ordinary people through houses. So like, in other words, it basically created a system in which ordinary people can accumulate wealth and pass that wealth on to their children, but it only includes white people. So the result is, 70 years later, we've got this immense racial wealth gap where white people are just trading houses among their children and grandchildren and getting more and more equity, getting more and more wealth, while people of color are left out. And it's weird to say that the left response to that should be like, well, I mean, on the one hand, it sounds logical if you're like, okay, well, black people should just be included in that, and we'll all trade wealth together. But that seems like a very liberal kind of way of looking at it. It doesn't seem like it's really addressing the larger issue of having us trade wealth through property and accumulate wealth through property, which is the heart of the whole fucking thing. I mean, to me, I understood. I mean, there were a lot of different moments where I understood like what leftism is versus liberalism, etc. But one of them was like getting that like, all my labor goes to my landlord, and understanding that because I've rented my whole life, I've never fucking owned a house. I don't know if I'll ever fucking own a house. And that, because you need a lot of money to get a house, and I don't have that. And I assume that like many of the people that I know that are my age that have houses, they had help from their parents or whatever. I don't know. Yep. But I don't have that. So I've rented, and more and more conscious of the fact that I give my money, like a gigantic portion of all the labor I do goes to this dude that gets it because his mom gave him the house. And that part of it is fucking really, really aggravating to me. So yeah, the idea that we achieve equality or by just kind of reimagining that system so that more people can access wealth that way seems really, really limited.
It is, it's really bizarre. And it also then disallows us from considering all the other different systems that, home ownership sets in place. You and I were talking a lot about the suburbs, and I think, you've talked about the burbs and how ghastly it can be to live there. And I've lived in a burb as well. And there are just differences in how one operates in a suburb, right? I mean, but home ownership in itself, whether it's in the city or whether it's in a suburb, kind of starts to encourage weird systems and ways of people relating to each other, which I think ultimately are destructive in so many ways. So I'm thinking, even something as basic as lawns.
Yes,
right?
yes.
Suburban, right? Home ownership is you have a plot of land, and next to that little, in that little plot of land is another little plot of land. Even if you're in an apartment, right? You have somehow, if you're living in a condo, you have access to, I don't know, a tiny little brickyard at the back or something. But everyone's obsessed with that, and everyone's obsessed with how you maintain that and how you maintain lawns, especially in the burbs, which is where, this whole notion of home ownership is rooted, literally and metaphorically. So you get this concept of lawns, and you get this whole ecological disaster that is lawns.
Yeah. And I mean, not just lawns, but just the whole concept of landscape architecture and that becoming something that was, originating in the cities to sort of do exactly what you're saying, create a space for nature within an otherwise industrial space. But then, as the suburbs are kind of developing as a concept in the 19th century, you get these basically the first gated communities where rich people are building these enclaves outside of New York and Philadelphia and Chicago, where they're places that are these really just beautifully cultivated parks. They're made by the same people that are making Central Park and the places in the in the cities. So yeah, that idea of having a kind of place in nature, but that at the same time it's nature that's been sort of cultivated and curated for you is something that I know that we've had people on this show. I'm imagining Sarah Tabor, because she was on the show thinking about agriculture and just how much we've fucked up the native species in this country. And it's a big conversation out here in California because so much of what we've done has created and putting housing where housing shouldn't be has created wildfires, and has created a situation where people are living in areas of the hills that regularly burn, and it's pretty fucking stupid to do that. But developers, they don't give a fuck, and that's part of the discourse too, is that there's the kind of desire for homes and like desire for like the way that Dolores Hayden puts it is the triple American dream of homeland, homeland and community, and that like the developers only really gave a fuck about like selling a really kind of superficial image of that rather than a real one, and the result is this kind of like I don't know like fake world in which there's sort of no central planning to any of it, and like that part of it has created this sort of like patchwork of housing that is awful. I mean, to me, it's like housing and that lawn thing you're talking about is a massive part of understanding the ecological catastrophe that is that is Western culture and American life. So it's really fucked up, but like somehow the dream of the American home is part of the disaster of American capitalism.
Right.
But I don't know how to get out. I don't know how to get out of that, Yasmin, because I want a house too. Yeah. And like that part of it is like,
who doesn't?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, because we're all. How else do we feel secure, right? I mean, I was talking to a friend of mine who's, I think, 25-year-old or 23-year-old niece had just graduated, and he said, yes, she graduated, and her anxiety was about rent and how she could afford rent, so she ends up becoming a homeowner. So she ends up taking on, and again, the other system, you have landscaping and you have what we've discussed as ecological disasters, right? I mean, Chinatown, movies like Chinatown and Who Killed Roger Rabbit are all about that. But then you also get this incredible system of debt, this production of the indebted subject who has no choice. I mean, look, I don't have anything in my bank account to say, unless I get a windfall of some sort, I'm not going to be able to ever afford to buy a home. But if I got a chance, I would probably do it, because what else do I have to guarantee me security in this particular culture and climate to ensure that I will have a home, a roof over my head, where the rent isn't being driven up every year, or even sometimes, more often than that. So who doesn't want to own a home under these circumstances? But you have, for instance, 25-year-old or people like you and me, and, who would rather be, perhaps when we get some spare money or spare time, would actually prefer to travel. I would prefer to travel.
Yeah.
Right? And the 25-year-old, for fuck's sake, should be saying, okay, I graduated, my treat to myself is going to be I take a trip around the world for 6 months. Instead, the 25-year-old has to walk into a fucking bank and, basically tie herself to the gigantic debt machine that this country runs on, and now has to worry about things like, if the heater blows, right? That's like a $3,000 expenditure right there. I mean, that's the other thing that people are not told when they're seduced with this idea of home ownership, is that home ownership is also something that can really fuck you over unless you have a decent amount set aside in the bank. I remember even Anthony friggin' Bourdain, who could afford, right? He said, I bought a home and I fucking hate it because you never really own. And that's Anthony Bourdain, who was extremely wealthy.
Yeah, it's a giant. I mean, I've been told that like my whole life from it's weird. It's like this kind of contradictory message you get from culture and everywhere else of the homeowner set, because the homeowner set is always like, oh, wait till you get a mortgage, you'll be a slave too, and it's like this sort of like joke, this cultural joke of the mortgage as this sort of, but that part of it is real. The other part of it to me though is like, generationally, we're talking about, you mentioned young people, and I think, there are young people that are buying homes, but for the most part, they're fucking not. And so, like, there's the kind of like, if this has been, this is the part of it that really like doesn't make any sense to me. Maybe we need Nathan Tankis over here to like economically to speak of it, because I really don't understand kind of, especially right now, like in the pandemic, like as soon as the pandemic happened and they said like, okay, we're shutting down the economy, everyone stay home. Right. People were like, okay, well, we're obviously going to need some sort of financial assistance and they're probably going to cancel rent and things like that. None of that happened. And then like, when it became clear that we were getting nothing but the $1,200 check, maybe there was this sense of like, from the left, maybe, that people were like, okay, well, then we're going to do rent strikes. And every time the 1st has rolled around, whether it be April 1st, May 1st, June 1st, there's a little like a flare up on Twitter of people saying, hey, the 1st is coming, we should do a rent strike. And it never fucking, like, I don't know, maybe people are doing it, but I don't know. But either way, it seems like an impossible situation for people to survive this. I feel like in the fall, I mean, we're already living close to Los Angeles where, there were 50,000 people living in their cars, 100,000 people on the streets before the pandemic even fucking happened. So don't you think that we're going to see more of that? It just seems like homelessness is just going to increase because how can anyone pay the rent right now?
Homelessness will increase, but what is interesting to me about the United States, the thing that struck me when I moved here many years ago was how the U.S. is particularly adept at erasing the presence of homelessness.
Oh, yeah.
So I think what's going to happen is we're going to set up sort of these mobile structures where people will be shoved into perhaps areas. It's sort of like the way we set up massive, like here in Illinois, for instance, in Chicago, we took over the McCormick Center as an emergency bed place. So we set up 10,000 beds, which was wise, in anticipation for the possibility of a real spike in infections, which hasn't happened here yet, etc. But I suspect that those kinds of places will then be taken over to house people who are homeless, so that we don't let our cities look bad, as it were.
Right.
So I think homelessness will spike. But the other issue, though, is that I think what's not going to get counted, of course, there are absolute, right, the clear kinds of homelessness that you and I can recognize, right? I mean, dude is homeless, dude is carrying, his entire life's belongings around with him in 2 rollaway bags and 16, trash bags. We know that person is homeless, right? So those are the obvious kinds of homelessness we can discern. But I'm also wondering about the range of homelessnesses that we might not see, right? So those of us who are more precarious, for instance, and might, for instance, be bouncing from, say, couch to couch for a while.
I think there's going to be a lot of that.
Right.
You're right. It'll happen in stages for people.
Yes, exactly. And then, maybe a year down the line, the person might just fall off the cliff, right? Or maybe 6 months down the line, because how long can you keep doing that? And so, people might exchange labor. There will be all sorts of mobile sorts of arrangements between people. But the question is, how long can we sustain this? Given also then that the economy, although, yes, I know we just heard about all people going back, to work and more jobs, but that's also, that's sort of a fallacy. We know this. And so what exactly is going to happen around the pandemic, I think, is that we're going to see invisible forms of homelessness. We might see people, I don't know, there might be mobile. Now that all these places that were office sharing places are either shutting down or reconfiguring, I'm not sure exactly what's happening. We might see weird, interesting arrangements that are temporary and quote unquote illegal for a while. I don't know. I mean, I just feel like when I moved to this country many years ago, I moved here from Calcutta, where it's very hard to miss the homeless. And, it's hard. I mean, it's impossible because you're literally tripping over people who are dying on the streets. And then I moved to Lafayette, Indiana, and there was this whole ruckus because there's this bridge between the twin cities of Lafayette and West Lafayette, right? And there were all these people living under the bridge. So there was this massive uproar when I turned on the TV in my first month there. There's this massive uproar in the town of West Lafayette and Lafayette, Indiana, about all these awful people living under the bridge, and this is dreadful and unsightly, and we're not going to have this again, right? And then they said, we're going to make this problem go away. And then sure enough, those people disappeared. And I, this kind of clueless little foreigner from Calcutta, was walking around going, so where did they go? And no one could tell me. It took me many years, after many years of figuring out how things worked. But basically what had happened was they had taken all those people onto buses and pushed them outwards into the smaller towns around.
Jesus.
Right? So they just literally took them onto the buses, shoved, and that's what happens in Chicago as well quite often. People are just bussed around and bussed out of sight. So I think this country, in large part because this country is so bloody massive, and this, and
just disseminate them around. That's so fucked up, though. It's. I mean,
exactly.
And to me, it's okay. I'm thinking about solutions, because there's the solution that our society is currently pursuing is just either ignoring it or bussing them around, bussing homeless people around. I wonder about. the why everything has failed. Like every liberal attempt to, because at some point we started building housing projects in cities, right? And saying like, well, this is going to house a precarious population. And like, I think that everyone, like the consensus is that project and set of projects failed, like in every American city. And so, it's like, it doesn't seem like there's any new sort of conversation about that. In fact, it went backwards in terms of New York City. I don't know if this is true in Chicago, but like, when they're building these luxury towers that like some Russian billionaires are going to fucking buy and not even stay in, when they're building those towers, like the city says to them, well, you gotta build some affordable housing within that, and so it was a big. In other words, they're just like, there's no government program to create housing. It's just sort of like begging developers to include a little bit of but either way, it was big news a few years ago when like one of these towers was built and they built like the entrance for the affordable housing on the back end. And they called it people called it the poor door. And it was sort of like this really ghastly physical representation of inequality in the city. But like, that seems like literally the people that are building any kind of affordable housing. I mean, wasn't this Grenfell Tower in London as well, which burned and it was like made of fucking styrofoam. So in other words, the more we use like these like capitalist developers as the like engine of trying to create equality, the more we fuck poor people over.
Definitely. And, with affordable housing, when I was involved in some housing activism in Uptown around the massive gentrification project, what was interesting is that when we started the conversation, the term we insisted on using was not affordable housing, but I forget, it was another term. See, I can't even remember the term now, but it was something like, cheap housing. I can't remember. But developers and the city didn't like the term. So they used the term affordable, which is a bullshit term in many ways because it can mean anything like, 75,000. Right. So that's affordable based on what is the median income of the people who can afford to buy units in that building. So the unit is so affordable housing in itself. The term itself is clouded in all of the shittery. But I think that's one issue. But I think the other issue around housing and access to such, and the presence of this poor door and what happened to Glenfell Tower and so on, is that housing is so, and I think this is a worldwide phenomenon, right? That housing is deeply embedded in this idea of a moral character. That somehow housing, and if you think, I'm thinking about. Gosh, I'm thinking back to, say, Dickens, and I'm thinking about, Austen, and I'm thinking about the ways in which even in just, literature, right, this idea of ownership of housing, who has access, and when I think about, for instance, Jane Austen and her heroines, right, some of whom are always dependent on rich relatives for housing security. I mean, that's really, Jane Austen is not, and you and I know this, but Jane Austen is not a romance novelist. She's a novelist of the economy. You and I and Nathan one day should have a conversation about that. But, she's really a novelist of the economy, and she's a novelist of housing, really, because that's really what her heroines are constantly embroiled in from the beginning, right? From the first paragraph of almost every novel of hers. Her discourse is entirely about who has housing security, who has housing, who owns homes and who doesn't. That's really what the conversation is about. Everything else is just, added on to that. But I guess the point I'm trying to make is that it's always been around, and then the question of landlords, right? Again, the historical attitude, and in America, it's a very sort of resistant narrative that you should not be renting because that means it's not just a question of giving your money to a landlord, but that you are subjugated to a landlord. And that, of course, has very interesting roots right back, if you think about England, right? And you think about the relationship, right, between the landowning class and the serfs and all of that. So we sort of have an imported version of that, really. And it's all mired in this whole economic history of people being not attached, not having, a right to what they stand on is all very much also bound up with questions around morality and who, and character and all of that. I was just reading, and as I was talking to, I was trying to find the article, and of course, because I have 200 tabs open, it's become an impossible task. But there was an article I read, and I'll send it over to you if you would like to post it, where someone said that, this whole question of home ownership, he was an economist of the 1930s, and he said, and he was cautioning against what was happening at the time, which was a surge, right? Like, I think at the time, home ownership was only around 35 to 40% of people were owning homes. And at the time also, you actually had to put up as much as 50% down, which is unthinkable today, because of course now everyone says, 0% down and blah, 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 and then you get into trouble later on. But so things were swiftly changing, and this economist cautioned us and said, the landscape of home ownership, and the way he put it was, the landscape of home ownership is laid with booby traps. It's only going to get worse from here on. And this was something like 1945. He was warning us about this.
Yeah.
So, this is a long-term project on the part of, and it's not a Democrat or Republican or left or conservative thing at all. It's a weird-ass Western / I would say, I think universal American. It's a very particular American idea.
It's funny when you say that. Is it left or right? Because that's the question I have often. Because it's really confusing when you think about it that way. Because it's so kind of ideologically consistent. But the moral character of it, I'm thinking about a couple things. One is that, I think that home ownership is basically synonymous with American freedom for people, right? It's like being free of the landlord and having your own place and that sort of thing. But I'm really interested, and this is where I thought that, when you and I were first thinking about having a conversation about housing, I definitely anticipated that you might take it to this place, which is that, what would a queer left housing policy look like? Because, the other part of the housing in America has been how much it's tied to notions of family, right? And like how notions of family have been basically like the people who own homes are married straight people with children, that's to me a part of like what home ownership is as well, is sort of like, that narrative, that standard kind of straight person narrative in America is you get married and then you buy a house. And it's like it's one of the key ingredients in like life, getting married, buying a house, having children, raising children, and the house actually existing for the children and for the wife, and I mean, the gender conversation on houses is fucking huge, right? So like that part of it to me is I wonder like, well, if all of that gender shit, in addition to all this horrible capitalist shit we're talking about, all that gender shit is embedded in the house too, then like what would it look like to break that up? Like how do we change our neighborhoods and change the way we think about housing as a way of expressing or a kind of resistance to that really straight story, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Sure. So two things. One is an anecdote, which is I once spoke to someone who said, they moved to the burbs, and then they said, well, and they got this, ratty ass little lawn, quote unquote lawn, and they said, well, we got a lawn, so of course we had to get a dog.
Like it's like of course.
Yeah, right. So you own a home and you have a lawn, and then you have to get a dog, and then you have to have 2 children and 2.5 children, and then and then the children have to have piano lessons, and then you have to drive them all around town the whole fucking day. So what is fascinating is how home ownership is linked up to a particular lifestyle. Now you would think, right, that you would hope that once the gays got married, things would change,
right?
And they haven't. But I do want to talk about what a queer radical left, attitude towards housing might be. But I do also want to point, especially to your listeners, who've heard me go on about it, but who may not be aware of this, that the biggest case, right, the big marriage case of Edith Windsor, which is the one that brought gay marriage into being, one of the two or three big cases, right? So the big Edith Windsor case was about Edith Windsor was portrayed as this poor little old lady in her 80s sitting in a drafty little apartment in New York and, warming her hands over this little fireplace she had made by burning her beloved children's books. And oh, look how dreadful it is when her spouse died, when her, her lesbian wife died. She had to pay $363,000 for it in estate taxes, and isn't that dreadful? And everyone was talking about, oh, death taxes are driving us into penury, and gay people should be allowed to avoid estate taxes the way straight people are. All of that was motherfucking bullshit, because Edith Windsor and her, dead spouse owned like 2 or 3 properties. Edith Windsor was worth around 10 million at the time her spouse died. The only people who pay fucking death taxes, quote unquote, are actually people who are paying estate taxes. The only people in America who have to pay fucking estate taxes are people who have estates worth 6 million plus.
Right. I don't cry for the taxes they have to pay.
Yeah. I'm like, motherfuckers, pay your taxes. That's what funds schools, unfortunately, and roads, fortunately, right? So pay your goddamn taxes. So and now she was right? Lambda was right. It's unfair. Sure. I'm with you on that. But let's not make, this whole business of calling estate taxes death taxes, right, is in itself interesting. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that queer, or rather I should say lesbian and gay ownership, as it were, of home ownership is very much directed through the lens of quote-unquote marriage equality, which I prefer to call gay marriage, and which in itself is actually, through itself comes through the lens of ownership of not just home ownership, but actually wealth. Because the only people who benefit from that whole estate tax shittery that Edith Windsor was fighting for are wealthy people. But what the gay marriage movement did was to mobilize quite a few million gays and lesbians by deluding them into thinking that Edith Windsor's issue mattered in their lives. It did not. Because there are something like 0.01% only of people in this country owe that kind of death taxes.
That to me, that's insane to take the notion of, it's so cynical too, take the idea of equality and equality for gay people, and everyone says, hooray, we all support that. And okay, let's take that energy and put it towards, getting rid of the estate tax, which only benefits fucking 1% of gay people. It's such a fucking cynical lie.
Right.
Yeah.
Getting rid of it only makes them richer. Right. Exactly. So there was that issue, right? So gays and lesbians have consistently fought to become just like straight. And that's what everything that the gays and lesbian movement has argued for in the last 20 odd years, including immigration, right? Immigration, for instance, you weren't allowed to sponsor your same-sex partner for immigration the way straight people could. But what gets ignored in that whole conversation is that the only people who can actually even sponsor even their straight partners for immigration were wealthy people. You have to prove to the state that you can actually support both of you for 4 years or something after, even if you lose your job. So you have to have a tremendous amount of wealth to be able to actually even qualify for sponsorship. So again, even immigration, right, for gays and lesbians, all of it was about wealth and, of course, home ownership, because that's one of the assets you use to prove that you have wealth, right? So the gay and lesbian community, consequently, has never been about in any way disrupting all these. They've just quietly sort of absorbed that model of, 2-person household, et cetera, children. So Oak Park, for instance, which is a suburb of Chicago where I used to live, Oak Park is like the most lesbian suburb you could ever find. And it's like a burb. Yeah. And it's filled with lesbians and their children and their 2.5, whatever, their little houses, everything. So it's extremely, and of course they're very progressive and blah, 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 all of that. But it's basically, it's another kind of straightish, suburb. Now, in terms of queer radical, what would a queer radical left perspective on housing be? What would that look like? Well, you've got groups like Gay Shame in San Francisco and Oakland, who have been agitating against the YIMBY movement, which is the Yes in My Backyard movement, which argues 2 stupidly, right, that the way to solve the housing crisis, build more, as opposed to let's build an equitable idea of housing. What does housing look like? What does housing equality look like? So, and then, yeah, I mean, there have been over the years in queer history, there have been many ways in which queers have formed interesting and dynamic, fluid households, which are not defined by mother, father, child, or children. But those increasingly are under threat because, as as it is, gays and lesbians in particular have always been terrified, and justly so, of being called pedophiles, etc. So the very concept of fluid relationships and fluid household, configurations, all of that has been sort of put on hold, or is very sort of I wouldn't say underground, but certainly you don't see as much of those. Now, you do see a lot of the discourse of polyamory, and that, as you know, I think is complete shit.
Yeah. Well, it's funny you bring that up, because what I was thinking about is, if we're thinking about kind of like some of the more experimental, ideas of living, I think a lot about the 60s and 70s, and the 70s especially, where like, all these mainly like white hippie people, like started communes all across the country, and like the legacy of that movement is kind of all over the place, but it didn't really take off, and it didn't really it didn't overcome or overwhelm. I mean, I think a lot of those communes were like, basically they said, we're going to set up like a model of a community that everyone else will see is so successful that they'll all get a part of. But it to me, like the legacy is also like, well, at some point you got to confront the power, though, because you're still just living, like communally within or on top of this disaster. So that part of it is weird. And also, like, when I was young and I was single and I just was kind of wandering around, I thought I was thinking about these issues a lot, and I kind of was someone who felt like communal living made sense to me in my head. But then whenever I was like around those people, or I couldn't fucking do it. Like, I want to live like and it's like living with, it's the worst form of like living with roommates, where you have and really like there are still leaders, there's still authoritarianism, there's still like labor that has to be done. I think that's part of it too, is like living with roommates or living communally, you always have like this fucking like bulletin board or chalkboard where everyone like divvies up the chores, and it never works because everyone fights about it. And like that, those are irreconcilable things about living. I don't know if that's because we're Americans, we're already like so used to having our own space, etc. But it almost seems like culturally, we're very, very bound to this idea, and to me, I'm like, I'm kind of a misanthrope. I don't want to live communally with people.
I don't.
And that part of it is a real contradiction for me, because I'm like, well, obviously we should all live communally, but I'm going to live apart from everybody else.
I don't think it's a contradiction at all. I don't think I'm the same way. I look at my lovely anarchist friends and I go, I love you all. I will never live with you, and I don't want to live in a world determined by you either. I'm just like, also, I want to keep saying to them, put the fucking toilet seat down.
Exactly. Yeah.
But also, I think that, gender, right? Gender and power dynamics in those communes were also, I think, what have stalled them, and for good reason, right? Because, as we know, I mean, it doesn't take too much for a commune to turn into a cult.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. They're like a bunch of like daddy farms is what ends up happening. Yep.
Yeah, I mean, so you get, this sort of Rajneeshpuram style shit, on a more extended level. It's a great documentary.
I love it. Yeah, we did an episode about it, actually. Wild Country.
I've got to listen to that. It's a great weird-ass documentary about weird-ass people from my part of the world. But I mean, communes, I think that unless there is extreme intentionality and extreme systematic way of thinking about power dynamics, and if they're in it, and if a commune does not have a generationally induced way to keep up that system, it's fucked. Yeah. Because often what happens, though, is, as is like, there's one generation of people who really work hard at something to create a communal safe environment, and they are always intentional. And I know, I mean, I have friends who worked on communal housing here in Chicago, and it's a lot of work. But the thing is, you get one person or two people, or maybe max 5 people in one generation. Let's say three housemate complexes down, and you get just 5 of them who decide they want to fuck things up. The whole experiment goes to shit, right? So it has to be, and it's a lot of work. It's a tremendous amount of intellectual, cultural, social work to actually make sure that kind of, intricate living situation actually works out. So there is that. And then there is the simple, the very simple fact that you and I are both cognizant of, which is that human beings in general are shit. And even shittier when they have to be accountable for something as simple as do the dishes.
I'm glad you brought up Wild Wild Country, because that for me, like, both groups were a bunch of assholes. You know what I mean? And totally. I was like the Rajneesh people that show up and they just, fucking, they're a bunch of weirdos who take over and they're insane. And like the guy who's leading them is a fucking psycho, And so all of them I just thought were really annoying. And like, you notice how many of them were like white people who had because they had like bought this whole exotic idea, that like this person was special. So there's that, but then there's like, it's so funny to watch these like white people in Oregon who are literally sitting on like fucking Indian land, and they're like, how dare these people just show up and there are people already living here and they want to just take over and live here instead, and how dare they? And we're like, isn't that the most American fucking thing? Isn't that what you did? So like that discourse, it almost makes me feel like we're still fighting over the land, like we're still fighting over who gets to have the land.
And we're still being genocidal about it. And I think you're right. And our modes, when I was growing up, my older brother had a real fondness for Wild West movies. So I watched a lot of them. And actually, who's the famous Italian composer just died?
Morricone.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And the all those theme songs of his, the music, I grew up with all of that. I loved it.
Yeah, me too.
Good, the Bad, the Ugly, right? All of the spaghetti westerns and so on. But all of those movies were about domination, but they always hid the domination, right? And then, of course, the Native American was this dark, skulking figure trying to take away the white girls, et cetera, et cetera. And I think what's interesting to me about the whole question around housing now, right? We do talk, is that we have simply shifted that mode of domination into ways that capital absorbs as more acceptable. And that's why I'm continue to be puzzled by especially parts of the left's obsession with home ownership and the idea of ownership of land as some sort of safety measure, as some way of producing wealth and security, because it's so embedded in that, that what people refer to as that sort of colonizing move, but also that, that system, right, of home ownership and so on, all of that produces horrible things like debt, horrible things like, the questions, Americans are so obsessed with neighborhoods, right? So all of this talk about housing and where do you create housing and to which quote unquote minority neighborhoods do you give, housing incentives, all of that is also implicated in what kinds of neighborhoods get developed and what kinds don't. Right? What kinds of neighborhoods get good schools and what kinds don't? What kinds of neighborhoods get transportation, water, right? All of that, food, grocery, food deserts and all of that. So it's just weird to me that we are so invested in the system that is actually so destructive from the bottom up, and not just, its colonial legacy, but its implication in a really brutal capitalist system, and that we can't seem to think about anything beyond that. And we're talking about Nathan, right? And Nathan's, wonderful work in MMT is also about saying that, money is weird. Like, money doesn't fucking exist. Money is just funny shit. Money is funny shit. And I wonder why we can't, and I think on those lines, we have to think about housing and this whole idea of scarce housing, right? As fucked up, funny shit that's cooked up by a collusion between politicians and developers. I remember years ago when I was on this LGBTQ blog called Billerico, and I forget how the housing issue came up, but someone actually popped up. I think he went and checked. I guess nowadays you can find anyone's address anywhere, right? So he checked on my address, and then he responded to me online by saying, well, if you're going to live so close to the lake, you should, you don't deserve that.
Wow.
Basically, I was told that as a poor person, I should not be living so close to the lake, and that's the kind of price I would have to pay, blah, 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 blah. So, housing in this country, it's this idea of being about freedom, blah, blah, blah. But it's not. And
it's the central engine of exploitation in so many ways. And
exactly.
I mean, it's like it's such a fundamental part of everything. I mean, literally when you talk about food deserts and like the forgotten neighborhoods and things like, I think many Americans who buy homes are just like thinking, well, I'm buying my way out of that. Like I'm purchasing like my way out of the ugly neighborhoods and into the good ones. And like that part of it makes me think that, home ownership is kind of like Hamilton in the sense that, especially for liberals, they know it's wrong. They know it's embedded with, racism and all these horrible things of capitalism, but they want it anyway. And it's enjoyable. Right. And like they're going to find a way to ignore those unpleasant parts of it and just get over it and just enjoy the show, and the show is their life in the suburbs. And
I think a lot. And I think a lot of African Americans, for instance, where I live, in the South Side, and I live in Hyde Park, which is kind of a bubble in the South Side, right? But Hyde Park, Mike Nichols apparently is the one who said that Hyde Park is all about black and white uniting against the poor. And a lot of that uniting against the poor has to do with driving out undesirable black people out of this neighborhood that we call Hyde Park, and then establishing, if you come to Hyde Park, it's like most of it even now is still, this beautiful sort of Oxbridgey. It was very deliberately built to look like Oxbridge. So it's very idyllic and it's very integrated. One of the reasons why I persist in living here is that it's the most integrated neighborhood, as far as I can tell, in the city, etc. But yeah, so there's that aspect of it. And at the same time, what I find, we talked about the movies, right, and the films and TV that we could sort of talk about as well. What I find so fascinating about cultural representation about housing in the U.S. historically is that cultural representations have in some ways reflected those tensions as well.
Yeah.
So, I mean, we talked about Get Out and Us, for instance.
The Jordan Peele collection.
Yes. Yeah. And can I just say, when I watched Us, I texted a friend of mine right afterwards, and I said, he's a very close friend of mine, and I said, just so you know, we are never fucking living in a house.
Yeah, he captures...
because Us is all about the fucking house.
Yeah, and to me, like the best artists, the ones it's kind of interesting that like the kind of conversation in pop culture is partly about this idealistic house, but so much of it has been about problematizing that house and making it terrifying. I mean, to me, like like looking at like the way David Lynch in Twin Peaks portrays, the typical American suburban house, or even in Blue Velvet, it's just like pulsing with dread, and Americans watch that and they go, oh yeah, absolutely, I recognize that. And you're like, well, what the fuck? How is it that we can like build our entire society around this notion of having this ideal house, and at the same time consume culture that's entirely about how this house produces terror, produces enslaved housewives, produces mass shooter kids and drug addicted children and eating disorders and bad dads. And I mean, we just know that like these places are bad, but at the same time we idealize them, and that's a weird thing to me.
It's really fascinating.
Yeah, I felt that way. I mean, Get Out is the same, right? Like there's kind of like I watched it last night, and like the very opening sequence is of like a kind of like hipster, like black dude, like walking down a suburban street, and he gets kidnapped. And as before he gets kidnapped, he's talking on the phone, and he's like, and he's really confused. He's like, I don't know where the fuck I am. I'm in some suburb, man. And he's kind of really like scared, and he says, I stick out like a sore thumb here, and he's already like feeling like, and so in other words, the discourse right from the start of Get Out is something that we all recognize. Oh, like this black man is not comfortable here because he fears that he might get killed, and we all laugh, ha ha ha. But at the same time, it's kind of a weird recognition that like the suburbs are these death machines, and like unequal death machines, and like that part of it is really strange to me, is that we have a discourse specifically about suburban homeownership in our pop culture that's usually like critiquing it from a really, you know, a place that's saying like these places are really violent, terrible places. And yet, you know, at the end of my suburbs class, all my students say they want that triple dream. They want a house, they want land, they want a community, they want to live in that place. So that part of it's weird because I don't know. I'm thinking about cities too, because, you know, cities are places that I think of as you know, liberals sort of, I don't know, liberals sort of idealize cities in some ways too. It's sort of like the, you know, places that are, you know, the where equality can be achieved more so than the suburbs. I don't know. It's a weird discourse.
It is, yeah. It's interesting because the city becomes a place where you can relinquish parts of your past, you know. And I'm thinking about Mad Men, which begins in a suburb, and that really kind of, I guess, you know, at the time it must have been a beautiful house, but we sort of look at it, I think, right, with all that plaid and the fur carpets, the house that he starts off with his little family, which is a well-off house. And then he kind of escapes that and goes to the city and gets this, you know, sort of French-Canadian wife who decorates the place in the sort of modernism of the time. And it's very sleek and has all of this glass furniture and all of that. And but it's about escape. You know, I mean, I Mad Men is just so fascinating because to me that's such a quintessential text about the American obsession with jettisoning parts of yourself, but also never really. It's a very it's fucked up psychoanalytically, right? I mean, it's about things that can never be reconciled and things that always never escape, etc. But the housing in that and the decor, right? I mean, one of the reasons that Mad Men sticks out so much to us is exactly the decor. It's exquisitely decorated, but its decoration is all about that constant shift at first between the burb and the city, and then being in the city. And it's all about, again, ownership of space, right? I mean, it's all about, you know, does the company own the office building or not, right? Does Don Draper own his house? Does he, you know, he gives a house to his, you know, he's actually technically bigamous, right? But he makes sure that his not wife, who's the actual Mrs. Draper living in California.
That's right,
makes sure
yeah.
That she has, he makes sure, the thing that he does for her is to make absolutely sure that she owns her house. I mean, you're absolutely right. Like, I think I love American representations of home ownership and homes, whether it's American Beauty or Mad Men or, you know, Rosemary's Baby. It's all about that fucking apartment, man. That apartment. I love that apartment.
It's the Dakota. It's the place where John Lennon was shot. You know, I watched Rosemary's Baby. It's weird to say this as a film guy, but I watched it for the first time, like, I don't know, a couple months ago, and I didn't realize, or I'd forgotten that it takes place in the Dakota. And yeah, it's weird because it's like it's portraying this like kind of like they're like upwardly mobile young couple having a baby, and they want to live in an apartment building, and that's the idealized space, but it's so like it's so haunted. It's another place that's like sort of
and that and that apartment is a character unto itself. Well, for one thing, it's so goddamn huge, and I think that apartment. And what's interesting to me is that they rent the Dakota apartment for something like $300 a month, which was huge at the time in 1966, I think. And then, of course, the Dakota years later became one of the premier, right, ownership, right? I mean, it became like they're all now. I don't even know if you can. I don't know if the word condominium fits what the Dakota apartments are. The residence is owned by extraordinarily wealthy people. So that in itself is interesting to me. That in New York City, you know, there's also the movie called The Apartment with Jack Lemmon, for instance, and Shirley MacLaine.
That's right.
And which is also about ownership, about renting an apartment. But it's so fascinating to me that New York City, which is today all about pushing people out, right? Gentrifying to the extent that you can only stay there if you have tons and tons of money to buy, you know, a tiny apartment, unless of course you're a New York Times reader, apparently. But New York City has moved from being a place where you could rent these great apartments to becoming a place where you have to own in order to actually be able to live in the city. I mean, I guess now the pandemic may have at least stopped that flow of gentrification? I don't know. But, I think Queens is next, right? That's the next burb that's going to be colonized.
Dude, I mean, I was priced out of New York City. Like, I mean, I was living far out already in Sunset Park, Brooklyn. And, it got to the point where, like, rents were going up around us. And I was thinking, I had a good situation in which our landlord hadn't changed the rent for years and years. But we thought if we moved anywhere, we wouldn't be able to afford it. Like we literally, it's a weird position to be in a city where you're paying a slightly lower rent because you've just been kind of grandfathered into something. But you're like looking around. I'm like, if I had to actually go find a place right now, I couldn't fucking afford one. Like I can't pay $3,000 a month. And like that part of it is really scary to me. I mean, it just boggles my mind if I'm sitting here like, barely making it. Like, what are people that are far? I know there are people that are far down the economic ladder from me. How they're doing, it just seems impossible. Like we're talking about. It's funny because like this conversation in part was about like this kind of dream of like when you have, what do you do when you have money, and what are you supposed to do in America, which is buy a house. But like for a growing number of people, isn't that just like a joke? Like they'll never be able to do that, and that part of it, to me is like that's where the conversation is going to head. In the future is kind of like how do you house people in a kind of economic reality in which there's like 40% unemployment and we didn't do anything to fucking address the fact that the rent is too damn high.
Right.
Yeah. Right. It's a nightmare, dude. I don't know the answer. I'm just throwing.
I don't know either. Yeah, I don't know either, and I don't think that our what sometimes parts of the left coughs up like hairballs, right? The idea of communal living,
right?
And blah, blah. I just don't think that shit works because it doesn't take into account that, no, actually, I shouldn't have to fucking share a space with 15 other people and one bathroom in order to not feel insecure. I mean, there's got to be better ways. And I think the better way to think about it might be to look at perhaps
even worse places. Are these like neoliberal, like Silicon Valley tech things where they're like, oh, we're gonna like we made a little village out of dumpsters and people can live in them for $500 a month, and you're like, what the fuck is that? I mean, you might as well spit in our faces when you say it. And like, there's one bathroom you can all share. And like that, the fact that you would see that even those like left experiments like repackaged as progressive, liberal projects is just sickening to me. I really don't know the answer because there are so many different like preferences in how people like to live. I mean, when I was young, I really idealized the like high-rise apartment in New York City, like I wanted to live in, that's how I wanted to live, and like go down the elevator and like go down onto the street. But I know not everyone wants to live that way. I guess what I to me, we live in a nightmare of housing in terms of like where we've gone, but part of the nightmare is because we're ideologically connected to it, and culturally connected to it, and that part of it's really intense. I'm not sure how you get over that because you've mentioned all these like different pieces of pop culture, and it is like it's almost like the discourse of housing is more present in pop culture than it is in politics.
I mean, yes, it is, exactly. And I wonder if one way to think about housing is to think about housing security as a right rather than home ownership and wealth creation.
There you go. I feel like that's good.
Left keeps getting bamboozled into moving towards home ownership and wealth, and blah, blah, blah. I mean, when you say, and especially, again, I bring myself back to this constantly because I'm constantly, especially living in Hyde Park and the South Side, where there's constant talk about, and with the fucking Obama Foundation here, there's this constant talk about wealth, creating wealth in the Black community, and it's all about home ownership. But, the fucking GI Bill, right? The GI Bill was supposed to have, it did, in fact, allow a couple of generations of mostly American men, for instance, to gain college educations and also to own homes. However, one of the little known facts is that African American men were not granted those. You could not, because of segregation, and also just because of what we would call redlining today, African Americans were not allowed to avail. Even though they were also veterans, they were not allowed to avail of the same opportunities, including of education and of home ownership. So I guess the point I think we need to make is constantly is, look, this project is fucked from the get-go. How about we just smash it and we start thinking about, not about, for instance, saying, 15% of this high rise will be, we used to call it, that's the term I've forgotten, low income as opposed to.
There you go. Yeah.
Housing.
Yep.
And that phrase has disappeared so much so that I've even forgotten what it was. That tells you a lot. But we used to say low income, not affordable housing. But, this idea that we build these massive, I love high-rise living. Because for me, I'm all like, yes, keep me away from the throngs. I don't want to be around people. Yes, I want elevators because of my bad, shitty knee, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm fine with that. But I think if we were to say that this is not about simply portioning out, let's say 15% of the units, right, to, the poor people, but actually saying, how about we create, a housing situation where we allow access to housing, not through the banks, not through a system that guarantees foreclosures down the line, right? But through a much more equitable system of people just deserve housing. I don't know. I mean, there's got to be a more, how about, it doesn't have to be a raffle because that's so arbitrary, but it could be people deserve housing. Yeah. So we build housing, okay, fine, but then we build it and we make sure that everyone has access to it. And it's
amazing that that's such a radical or revolutionary principle, as opposed, and also just, I mean, I love the fact that you brought up earlier this idea of how, from the beginning, home ownership had this like moral character to it. And you're like, how can it, I mean, okay, it's got a moral character that has something to do with the kind of like genteel manner of home ownership and that sort of thing. But there's also like, to me, it's like really, it's insane to me that when we say moral character, we're not talking about, something as simple as people deserve housing. People deserve to be secure in their housing.
I know that.
Yeah. Like, why isn't that part of the moral character of? I know the answer, because we're a capitalist nation built on fucking ugly, inhuman principles that we then try to tack on some sort of like morality or progressive notion on top of. But if it's rotten from the beginning, like asking or inviting more people to participate in it just seems like it's going to strengthen it and not really address any of those fundamental issues. I don't know.
And the other thing that we have to work on also, of course, is just general inequality, right? If people are not able to, we live in a society where people can't afford apartments or houses. And that is because of the extraordinary inequality we have spawned, that we see as somehow, that money should only, vast amounts of money should go to those who deserve it somehow. I mean, the system is flawed from the start. And I'm not even sure that, rent strikes, I think rent strikes are important, but it would be interesting for me to see, okay, how far does that go, right? Like how much do rent strikes actually militate against the entire system of home ownership? Are they still invested in it? And that my suspicion is that they are. But as long as, I guess the point I would want to make is that as long as we're always thinking in terms of that dichotomy between rentals and home ownerships, we're fucked.
Yeah, and does it? I mean, when I hear you say that, I mean, really, what's happening is like home ownership is inviting people to be complicit in capitalism, right? Like it's saying like, okay, well, I mean, it's the way unions work ultimately too. Is kind of like, hey, come on in, and you'll get the rewards too, and like that. Obviously, that has like a lot of like. Mainly like racial implications over the years. But like either way, the notion is still that like owning property and then capitalizing that property and like, gaining wealth from ownership of property, that's capitalism, right? And like to me, it's like saying it's really that's maybe its most insidious thing is it's like implicating everyone in that and saying like you too should make your wealth from owning property. And that part of it to me is like it's almost like reinforcing the lessons of the ruling class. Yeah, it's really scary.
It is scary. And I think at least in the United States, I don't see us moving out of that model anytime soon. I don't I don't see models that appeal to me in terms of alternatives.
Right.
I see a lot of resistance, which is great. I think Gay Shame does a lot of amazing work. Gay Shame has been on the tail of the YIMBY movement, for instance, constantly, much to the annoyance of the YIMBYs. And other housing activists. I do think that all of the critiques of the landowning class and rental strikes, all of that is important, but I don't know how to break us out of the model that we are all so deeply, literally and metaphorically invested in.
Well, it's going to come. I think the Black Lives Matter thing, in part, the uprising of the past, few weeks. I don't know where it's going, and it doesn't seem to have a clear direction right now. But at the same time, it served to me as a good reminder of like how we're not in control of history and shit just happens. Like energy just takes off, and the timing of that weird run up of like really awful killings that kind of culminated in the killing of George Floyd, and that video. Like there was an eerie kind of rhythm to all of it that just kind of exploded this energy onto the streets, and it's still kind of boiling a little bit out there. I think it's moved into like statues and shit like that. I don't know where it's going, but my point is that we don't know, like we don't know where energy is going to kind of take us, and that part of it I think is why I kind of roll my eyes at any kind of like left project that's like, this is what we're gonna do, because I'm always kind of like, well, how do you know you're going to do that? Like there are other forces at play here. And like, this is a really, really big project. And if we ever do see revolution in our lifetime in terms of like overturning all this institutional shit we've cataloged on this show about housing, it's probably going to come in an unexpected way. At least that's the way I see it.
Mm-hmm. Well, we hope for the unexpected.
Yeah. Right.
So far, it's the unexpected. This whole spring and summer is the unexpected that has brought us revelations of all sorts that we may not have anticipated. So
that's right.
Perhaps there'll be more unexpected, events and thoughts. I think it's thinking in the U.S. that's the problem. It's not that we lack action, but we lack a really radical way of rethinking the institutions like homeownership on which they're founded.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. Yasmin, it's always fun talking with you. I appreciate you sharing your thoughts with me.
Same here, always a pleasure. Thank you so much, David.
Of course, yeah, take care. Okay, huge thank you to Yasmin Nair. I always have a wonderful time talking with her. I hope you enjoyed our conversation. Go to her website, yasminnair.com, and support her work and read her writing. Really, really great stuff, as always, and we'll have her on again very soon. I know that. And check out our stuff, too, at patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. Support independent media. Pick the stuff you like and give them some money, because we need some different viewpoints out there. I think everyone understands that. Thank you so much, Yasmin, and thank you to everyone who supports the show. We will catch up with you very soon. Take care. Bye-bye.